So without any further ado, Ruth and Murray.
So first of all, I'm going to make sure, can you hear me? Excellent. This is a story that has, of course, like all historical stories, been researched, and like all historical stories, the newspaper on the Friday said exactly the opposite thing on Saturday, same paper, and the two papers on the same day never agreed. Letters home were completely contradictory, and sometimes you hit exactly the same words, and you know somebody just copied. So this is a story to enjoy because, like family stories, there's points of view coming from all directions. The research has been done, a great deal of it, by Murray. I've had fun with white gloves and archives, and we are both attributing our poor eyesight to microfiche and microfilm. But what really amazed us, we started working on this last year at this time, and then, oh, what a good idea, let's really push it, let's build it together, let's work together. And May happened. We're in the middle of newspapers from 1870, and the same words, the same images are on our television screen. Until May of this year, the 1870 fire was the largest wildfire in Canada's history. But the Fort McMurray fires changed that. This one is now number 2. We wanted you to hear how similar the events and the anecdotes are. So before we actually start into that story of the 1870 fire, we're going to give you 2 little anecdotes. One from May of this year, one from August of 1870.
I knew the fire was coming, didn't know when, and it really wasn't until the Mounties drove down our street with a bullhorn saying, "You've got 2 minutes, get out." I looked over at the dining room table. We'd been collecting things there, the laptops, some family photo albums, and important papers and passports and things like that. We just sort of scooped all that things up and into a box, and my daughter jammed her cat into his carrier, and we headed for the car. When I got outside, I was surprised. I was surprised at how tall the flames were and how close they were. They didn't look to be more than 3 or 4 backyard fences away. And when we got to the corner, drove down the street and got to the corner, before we turned, I looked in the rearview mirror and I could see our house catching fire. Fort McMurray, May 4th, 2016.
Robert Grant was woken by the howling winds. It had been, 4 o'clock, they were gale force, but now at midnight, they were near hurricane velocity, and there was a pressure and a heat, and he could smell seared wood. He had no time for anything else. Pulled his children from their beds and thrust them out of the house. Go for Poole's Creek. Cross the road into the neighbor's land, Poole's Creek. Little Robbie, now 10, had his 1-year-old brother in his arms as he struggled across the street, his mother pushed behind, trying to urge the other children to hurry. Mr. Grant abruptly spouted, "The church documents. Our papers." He turned and ran back into the house. Robbie and his siblings didn't even look back with the crack of the timbers and the falling of the roof. But Mrs. Grant turned and watched in horror. Her husband, his whole body encased in flames. Stittsville, August 17th, 1870.
The 1870 fire started a few days earlier. A work crew were taking a break. They took off their hats to allow that breeze to evaporate the sweat of their brows, and then jammed them back on to keep the sun off their face. It hadn't rained for over 3 months. The ground was dry and it was hard. Working for the Upper Canada Railway was good pay. But cutting and burning brush along the rail lines, along the dry ditches, that was miserable work at any time, especially on a hot day like today. A gust of wind caught a burning branch, blew it over into the field, into long grass. Workman turned. He picked up a half pail of water, and then he hesitated. His throat was parched, and this was the last of the drinking water. And then he pitched it on the branch. But in that moment of hesitation, that branch had an opportunity to create history.
The brush fire raced up the railroad track until it hit the grass fires just outside Arnprior. Nothing left to burn, it stopped. And then the wind changed and those fires pushed east. A 7-mile-wide front. The fire greedily devoured the bridges and the fields of Fitzroy and Terbolton. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Johnson, and some of the others of that vicinity had no time for anything but to grab up their children, their wives, and run for the river. As they made their way through the fields, they came upon the Pinney lands, closest to that river. Mr. Pinney and 2 of his men were out cutting down the Sweeney crop, trying to create a fire break. Pinney called out, "Men, help me! We will need seed for next spring." The wives reminded their husbands that the Pinney family had not done anything to help their community. And in fact, wasn't Mr. Pinney at this very moment cutting down Sweeney's land, his neighbor's land, to save his own? Possible food in a year's time did not weigh against the men's lives. The women said, "Come." But the men knew their duty. They knew they would need to start over, and the only way to start over would be to have seed. They told their wives to go down to the river, to take one of Mr. Pinney's lumber cribs. The rafts would be big enough to put the children in the middle, cut the raft loose, and then float it down to safety, downriver. There was no time to argue. The women rushed down to the water, dragging the children with them. And the men got to work. They pulled down those cedar rail fences that the fires seemed to grab hold of and dance along. They started to enlarge that fire break. The winds whipped up, the pressure mounted, and they could see the smoke curling over them. And then that black smoke turned orange as they could see the flames reflected. "Gotta go," the men said. "It's time. We've done all we can. To the river." But before they could make it even more than 5 steps, the wind turned and the fire raced inland, leaving the Pinney lands standing, untouched.
The fire moved across an area of old-growth forest. But this forest looked substantial. It was on rather thin soil, and the thin soil was on limestone rock. The fire so devastated that area that even to today, it's referred to as the Burnt Lands, a landscape that never recovered, a section between Almont and Highway 417.
Along that Burnt Lands road, Mr. Hogan had brought his family to Homestead. If he could get a house and shelter for animals, and the land fenced. He would have free land, title to that land. He would own it. And he was working hard to meet those deadlines. But the fire was coming, and he wasn't surprised when his neighbor sent a son. Get off. Move back towards the river. It's not safe. The fire's almost here. And so Mr. Hogan ran for the yard. He called into the house. Time to go. I'm hitching up the wagon. Mrs. Hogan called back, I've got lunch on the table. Who knows when we'll be able to eat again? Let's eat, then go. He didn't argue. He hitched up the wagon. And the children threw food into their mouths, stuffed it into their pockets. They jumped onto the wagon and they went down, out the farm lane, onto the road, north, towards the river. But in only 10 minutes, the smoke and the wind and the heat of the fire made it clear they couldn't go that way. It took forever to turn that wagon in the narrow farm road and move back south. But there was an arm of the fire coming from that direction, too. Hogan raced the wagon back into the yard, behind the cowshed. There had been a slough dug out. They'd worked on it all summer. It was only about 2 feet deep, but it would have to do. Built so that the cows could drink water without falling into the creek. It was not so big. They could take the newly built shed, the planks, the wood, put it over top. He told his son to unhitch the horse, let it go where it would, then help him by cutting the sod. Mr. and Mrs. Hogan pulled down the cowshed. They placed the pieces of wood over that slough. And then everyone in the family, the 15-year-old, the 9-year-old, the 5-year-old even, took those pieces of sod that Mr. Hogan was cutting, moved them over top the planks, and then all together, all save the infant, brought water, threw it over top of that sod so that it would be soaking wet, so that there would be no way for the fire to get down to them. Splosh, drip, drip. Splosh, drip, drip. Mr. Hogan told Mrs. Hogan to get the children down below. The minute they crawled under, the kids began to complain. The infant howled, and the 15-year-old declared he was a man. He would do a man's work. And together he and his father continued to throw water onto that sod. Splosh, drip, drip. Time passed, the howl of the wind increased, the pressure, the heat. The water began not just warm, but it began to heat to hot. There was no more splashes, just drips. Mrs. Hogan called to her men, "Come down!" But the wind was so loud she didn't think they heard. And then there wasn't even drips, just howling wind and oppressive heat. Time passed. The 9-year-old reached up to the wood, but his hand was almost burnt, it was so hot. Time. More time. And somewhere in the night, Mrs. Hogan knew that the child that had been coughing in her arms stopped breathing. More time passed. And finally she was able to reach up and push the wood aside. She crawled out, and she placed that infant beside the charred bones of the baby's father. And she looked over at what remained of her oldest son. Turned, reached down for the 5-year-old and carried her over to a rock, now warm from the fire. She turned for the 9-year-old, but he had stumbled after her, and the 3 of them sat on that rock, waiting for whatever morning would bring.
The fire raged down to the edge of the village of Carp, and then it came to an abrupt stop. The wind had died, but it hadn't died for a long time, a long period. It picked up again, but it picked up from a totally different direction, and it blew that fire around the village, leaving it basically untouched. The fire started across Huntley Township. It was now an 11-mile front. Cattle out to pasture didn't have a chance. They couldn't get beyond the fire around it. And the fire sometimes was traveling at 5 miles an hour. They couldn't outrun it. The heat, the flames, the smoke, drove some cattle mad, and they actually turned and ran into the fire. The fire was seen to have, in the open country, a rather interesting aspect. Was it looked somewhat like waves on an ocean. It would roll over, and then another flame would roll over, and it just seemed to creep across the landscape. It was heading towards the village of Stittsville. But before Stittsville was an area called the Tamarack Swamp. Again, there had been no rain for 3 months, and the swamp was somewhat dry, and that fire hit. It came in under the tamarack trees, rolled in to that area of dried needles. And then it just went up through those dry branches to the very tops of the trees. When it got to the tops, it would hop over to the next tree. Up the tree, down the tree, meeting in the middle. It made those trees look like they were exploding, one by one by one by one. And the wind pushed those trees over with such precision, lined them up as though they had been cut with a scythe. The village of Stittsville was destroyed. We've already heard about Robert Grant. Mr. Fred Richardson and Mrs. Harton both ran for the creek, but the fire outpaced them, and they were found burned in their fields. The only thing left standing were the stone walls of Mr. Kemp's house. A train pulled into the station the train pulled into the station in Bell's Corners. The engineer turned to the fireman and said, "I'm going to go up to the village for a cup of tea," and with a wink of his eye, he was gone. The fireman watched him go and didn't see, there was a bit of smoke in the air, but nothing that really bothered him. He now had a chance to do some maintenance around the cab, those little things that you never seem to find time for. And he was very involved in that sort of routine until he realized that there was a heavy smoke rolling over into that cab. And he went and he looked out, and he could see the fire heading towards Bell's Corners. He didn't believe that the engineer would make it back in time, so he fired up the boiler. He put the train in reverse. He backed it off from the train station and down the track a ways, and then he realized that the fire was moving faster than he could back up. And the only decision he could come to was that move forward, punch your way through the fire, and hopefully come out on the other side. So he prepared himself. He put himself, in the middle of the bulkhead, the very front of the cab. He had his heavy leather gloves on. He reached over with his left hand, pulled the throttle forward, and the train picked up, and as he hit the flames, as he hit the fire, that wall of fire, he put his other hand over his face to help protect it. The fire came down the sides of the engine, curled in on the windows of the cab, came down along the roof, curled under. Smoke and the heat. He could see the paint on the inside start to blister. It may have only been a moment, or 2 moments, or 10 moments, perhaps 100 moments. He lost all track of time. But he was successful. He brought that train out on the other side of the fire, and as soon as he realized he was clear, he let go of the throttle, and the engine came to a stop. And he looked over the village of Bell's Corners. 30-some buildings were now reduced to the town hall, a church, and a house. He looked back at that almost new train station, and it was reduced to just a pile of burning rubble. And then he noticed on the track, the fire had burned the ties out from under the rails. He peered forward and realized that a tongue of flame, a piece of that fire, had branched off and crossed the line ahead of him, and the ties there were burning. He had saved the train, but he was marooned on that piece of track.
And the fire continued towards Ottawa, greedily eating those dry cedar rail fences, pulling itself along, rolling across the fields, dancing through treetops, sometimes descending underground, eating the roots that were so dry, feasting on the roots of those stumps that had been left in fields, only to pop up, set fire and burn to the ground the farm buildings, come upon a village and set it to flames. Mrs. Clark heard banging on her door. She was coming awake, just barely, hearing Mrs. Shane say, there's a fire, and get the children into the wagon. I'm hitching up the horse. Mrs. Clark didn't bother putting any clothes on her children, just got them out and into that wagon. She helped up her neighbor's children, and the horse was pushed out of the rains, people screaming. It's a good thing horses have blinkers, because as they approached the edge of the village, both houses were on fire, the only way out, and they'd have to go through. Mrs. Shane called, "Get down, as low as you can, into that wagon bed. I'm going through." She flicked the reins, and through they went. But the flames reached towards her. Cinders fell on her dress. It caught light. And as the flames went up and the pain came through, her youngest reached up with a horse blanket. The oldest stood up in the wagon bed, put the horse blanket around her, and smothered the flames. But the sparks landed on him, and his shirt caught fire. With screams of pain, he pulled that blanket back and pulled it around himself, then dropped to the wagon bed and tried to put the cinders out, the ones that had fallen on the children. And those screams of pain made that horse rush faster than it had ever gone before. But even terror couldn't keep the pace up. And before long, the older boys were out of the wagon and running along beside it. For strong boys can run faster than a horse pulling a heavy wagon. It was dark with the smoke. They could hardly see, and when they came to the stream, the horse refused to cross the bridge. Mrs. Clark told her oldest, "Go to the horse's head. Pull it across." But one step back, and the boy knew. The fire had reached the bridge before them. It was burnt out. He started to unhitch the horse as the two women took the children down into the stream, into the center of the stream. But the winds whipped the water, and they were coughing as much from the water splashing into their face as from the smoke choking them. The heat became oppressive, warming the water. And then that black sky became orange and red and yellow and blue and indigo. And the branches and the brush on the side of the stream caught fire into blazing lanterns. And then it was gone. Black, occasional glowing red coals. It was a long time before the women decided the ground would be cool enough to walk upon. They crawled out of the stream on the other side. And for a long time, the only sound was bare feet on that hard, baked road. But after an hour, there were more bare feet. Every one of them had the same story. And all of them were walking towards the city, towards safety, towards help.
Mrs. William Simmons had been watching the fire for most of the day. It was far off, and she wasn't too worried about it. Her husband had left that morning with some other men to join with the firefighting crew. It was only after dark, when she looked out the window, that she realized the fire was indeed coming her way, and perhaps they should leave. She hooked the horse up to the wagon and got her 4 children into the wagon, and her aunt and uncle, who were somewhat aged and infirm. They started down the road. Her uncle was overcome by the smoke, and he lost his grip and he fell down into the road. Mrs. Simmons stopped, and she decided she would take the children and her aunt and lead them to an area where they should be safe. And she went back and helped their uncle back into the wagon, but he wasn't able to manage, and he fell back into the road a second time. And she helped him again, and he fell a third time. She helped him again, and he got settled into the wagon, and then he collapsed, unconscious, back down onto the road. He was now a dead weight, and she did not have the strength to lift him. She heard the screams from her children, and she turned and realized that the fire was in the process of encircling them. So she ran back, she grabbed the youngest and told the others, "Follow me, single file," and led them back to the wagon, got them in it, and then drove hard until they were safe, but having to leave her uncle behind to his fate at the side of the road.
People streamed towards Ottawa. And in Ottawa, the members of City Council met. The speeches went on and on and on. The council chambers echoed and re-echoed. Alderman Martineau stood. "Gentlemen, you have seen the smoke. You have tasted its noxious fumes. There is a wildfire that extends from Arnprior to Elmont, and it is coming towards us." "An exaggeration," called a voice from the back. "'Tain't," called another voice. "Those what know will tell you the flames came down like let loose from hell." There was some discussion about language, and then Alderman Martineau took the floor again. "You need only ask those who are straggling into our city, and they'll tell you of their crops burnt to the fields, burnt to the ground, and their livestock roasted in those fields. We have an element moving towards us. We need to prepare." Sheriff Powell stepped forward with his report. He began with a discussion of the good people of Ottawa and how they would rise to the occasion. Those who had would share with those who had lost. There was no need for long-winded speeches nor great moving words. The people of Ottawa would know what was right and moral. Of course, this council would be responsible for providing relief funds, some form of aid for those who have lost so very much. It was, of course, not his place to say what form that relief aid would take, but he wished to point out to the members of City Council that the coffers of the province of Ontario were filled to overflowing, and much of that money had come from the very lands which at this moment were burnt to the ground. Now, he did not want to extend any speeches, but it did behove this council, the members of this council, to petition the government of Ontario to provide monetary relief. Alderman Martineau stood. The sheriff, of course, is correct. There will be relief needed. But, dear sheriff, you are one step ahead of yourself. There are many things that must be done. We must put in place practices, precautions. A voice came from the back of the chamber. Mr. Chair, we have heard that the City of Montreal is offering a fire engine complete with hose and buckets and 4 fine firefighters. Has that offer been accepted? Mr. Chair, what of our own 3 fine fire engines? They have hoses. The Ottawa, the Gatineau, the Chaudière. Where will they be deployed? Mr. Chair, who will pay for reparations? Martineau's voice rang out. It is time to come to some plan. If the fire reaches the mills of the Chaudière, if the lumber and the sawdust catch fire, the fate of this city is sealed. We need a plan. And good people, you will hear the plan after the break. Welcome back.
The 18th of August. The 18th of August. The wind came up. It was fierce. It was blowing at gale force. By early evening, it had deposited between 3 and 4 inches of sand, dust, dirt, and ashes all over the center of the city of Ottawa. On the roofs, sidewalks, and for poorer people who didn't have well-fitting windows blowing straight into their homes. Bob Mason was a cabbie. Driving down the street, and he stopped beside another cab and leaned over and said, "I'm going home. There aren't going to be any fares tonight, and I'd rather have Stella in her stable with a pail of water than out in this mess." By 8 o'clock, all the cabbies were off the streets, as were most of the residents in Ottawa, except for a few intrepid mill workers who had made it to their favorite tavern. Tom, Alan, and Davy sat there when their foreman came in, James Purcell. He joined them. And of course, the talk of the evening was what to do. I hear there's a meeting over at the City Hall tonight. Oh yeah, just more hot air. That's what we need. You know, said Purcell, we only have 3 fire engines for this whole city. and they're fed by barrels of water that are hauled around on wagons. This fire's way too big for that sort of system. Won't work. Whatever happened to the idea of putting in pipes and hydrants? They were talking about that at City Hall a while back, and there's doing it in other cities. Oh, I have an answer for that. Those people in the fancy houses didn't want to pay the taxes. Well, if those mills go up, those fancy houses are going to burn too, despite having stone walls. Well said, young Davy. A new character walking across the room to join them, Etienne by name, sort of a grizzled old-timer with a scraggly gray beard. He was welcomed and moved down onto the bench. I've been fighting fires in lumber mills for 40 years. If you get sawdust anywhere near a flame, it's like gunpowder. Alan started to boast a bit. Well, yeah, we get fires in the mills, and Tom's good on the pumps, and Davy knows how to handle the hose. Purcell looked up and asked, Tom, do you remember how much water we pumped on that last fire? Down in the corner of Building 2? No, sir. No, I really don't know. You know, we're pumping river water, and we just keep pumping. It's endless supply until we don't need it anymore. It's not like being up here in town with barrels to fill. What about Dow's Lake? Someone asked. No. Dow's Lake is way too far out of town. It's at least a half a mile south of the town, maybe even more. Besides, it's also a little bit to the west. There's no way we can pump water out of Dow's Lake. The conversation continued. And Etienne said, no. I remember before Dow's Lake. It used to be called Dow's Great Swamp. And it started up there at the base of Hogsback Falls and came down to Mr. Billings' village, and then straight across where the reservoir is today and down the gully where Preston Street's built in. Went right down that gully until it got to the flats and out to the river. I worked on that dam. I was 18 years old. Old man St. Louis had the contract. He wanted some of us guys to get some of the work on the Rideau Canal and not have it all go to the Scotch. He looked at Alan with a big smile. And Alan looked back at him, smiling away, and said, maybe we should just blow it up. They had a laugh. Purcell was listening. Maybe we can do something with it now. Well, said Etienne, it's just packed earth. Maybe we can dig a hole in it, said Purcell. And you know, I'm going to go home and think about that. I'm going to sleep on it overnight. I'm tired. And with that, James Purcell got up, said goodnight, and left the tavern.
The next morning, the sun did not seem to rise. The smoke was so thick, the ash, that it was dark. Mrs. Carr was trudging, concentrating on putting one foot ahead of the next, droning softly to the 2-year-old fussing in her arms. Ahead of her, just a couple of steps, her husband had the 5-year-old in his right hand. 6-year-old balanced on his shoulder. He paused just a moment, switched the boys as he had so many times that evening. And they trudged on.
Tom stopped a moment at a mill door, looked up towards Old Richmond Road, and he could see that line of people straggling along it, occasionally hearing the cry of a child. refugees from the countryside. By early afternoon, there were more than 2,000 people who had arrived within the city. These had been people who were prosperous farmers, tradespeople in the small villages of Carleton County, living a comfortable life. And now they had nothing. They didn't even have their dreams.
There was a special meeting called of the city council, noon, and they all came. Alderman Featherstone, stood as chair and announced the goal, the purpose of this meeting is to decide from which direction comes the greatest threat, the greatest danger. And I believe, though I have heard stories of those fires coming up the valley, when I stand on Parliament Hill and look across the Ottawa Valley, I look across the Ottawa River, and I see the smoke, and I see the orange flames in the sky, and I believe that it is from the Hull side that comes our danger. Here, here, said Alderman Heaney. Here, agreed. Time to send those military over and tell them to stop the fire on that side of the city. And while I stand, I put forth a motion. I move that this council set aside, find in the budget some money for relief for those who have lost so much. I am suggesting $500, perhaps $1,000. There was a hubbub of voices agreeing, disagreeing, countering, and then a friendly amendment. In the end, the vote. The motion was carried. $1,000 would be put aside. Alderman Martineau stood to give a speech, but before he said a single word, a letter came from the mill owners of the Chaudière, a delegation. The letter was read into the minutes. The mills of the Chaudière are in imminent danger from the approaching flames, and we, the mill owners, propose that a public meeting be set for 2 p.m. this afternoon. We further propose that the members of council and the owners of the mills work together in concert, in cooperation, to prepare against this element. Alderman Musgrove spoke quickly. This would be imprudent. A public meeting would not serve, for it would cause panic in the streets. And perhaps every able-bodied man would rush to the fire line. It is the fire that is a danger, but the only true danger to the city of Ottawa would be sparks that would fly in the wind and land on the fine roofs of the fine houses, on the roofs of those businesses in our center city. If all able-bodied men went to the fire line, who would protect the inner city? Who would take care of our fine homes? Alderman Martineau stood and stared at Musgrove and said clearly, "It is the fire that is the danger. I move that all businesses be proclaimed closed and all able-bodied men be sent directly to the fire line to fight against this element." There was, of course, agreement and disagreement and counter-move, and in the end, the motion passed. A vigilance committee was set with members of the city council and owners of the mills, Sheriff Powell to chair. The agenda complete, the council meeting adjourned, and the vigilance meeting began. Within minutes, a dispatch was sent to the regiment, the 60th Rifle Regiment, asking them to march immediately to Hull and there stand the fire line. The engine from Montreal was diverted, along with its hoses and 4 firefighters, to Hull. There was a reconsideration, and the regiment was sent not to Montreal, but to Hull. Clarified, all went well. The ward leaders were assigned, each neighborhood to have a leader who would prepare his neighbors to fight the fire. And as those leaders were assigned, they were sent forth, and the fight began.
Extra, extra, extra. The newsboys were running through the streets, handing out copies of the proclamation recently just printed. Sometimes embellishing the story. All men to the fire line. Once businesses started to close, the streets became crowded. The teamsters in their wagons shouting to each other, "Make way, make way. I have valuable goods that must be moved." The sidewalks became crowded with people, many of them carrying boxes of valuables. 2 shop girls turned the lock on the shop door, got into that queue almost that the sidewalks had become. "Millie, what are you going to do now?" "I'm going to go back to the church hall. I was there early this morning and we were making soup and porridge. A bakery has promised us some bread. Feeding those poor refugees from the countryside. They are just so despondent. They sit on benches and they just stare out at nothing." "Where am I supposed to go?" called a man on the street. Somebody said, "The fire line. It's up on Bell Street, up on the escarpment at the end of the city, the western edge." Groups of men with picks and shovels and buckets were heading towards that line. Down in the flats, there was an eerie quiet. All the mills had shut down. The mill equipment, of course, not moving. But in the yards, there were wagons, people asking for instructions, receiving instructions, shouting back and forth, and many of the mill workers themselves heading up to the fire line. That included Tom and Alan and Davy. Where did Purcell say we're supposed to go?" "Oh, we're supposed to go to the very south end of the line, nearest to Dow's Lake." "I haven't seen Purcell all morning. Where's he been?" "Well, he met with Mr. Baldwin this morning, and I guess if this new vigilance committee, Mr. Baldwin will be on it as an owner, and the 2 of them were off to City Hall to talk about this idea of breaking the dam. And we'll just have to wait. We'll find out sooner or later." Tom turned to them and said, "I hope it's sooner. Look at that western sky. That was full of black smoke when we started out. It's now red. That's the glow of the fire on the clouds of smoke. And that wind is blowing it straight at us." The men arrived at the south end of the fire line. They were almost surprised to see how many of their co-workers from the mill were right there as well, chatting amongst themselves. Somebody tapped Alan on the shoulder. "Etienne, are we going to do it? Are we going to blow up the dam?" No, Etienne, I don't think we're going to blow it up, but we may take it apart a bit. We'll just have to wait and see. Mr. Purcell's due to come soon." And so they did. Baldwin, Purcell, and another man. Baldwin spoke first. "Attention, men. What we're going to do today is cut a channel in the St. Louis Dam. We're going to let the water pour down into Preston Street. We're going to create a barrier that will be as much as 180 feet in some places, and that water will sink into the ground so the fire can't travel along dry routes underground and pop up on the other side." Mr. Purcell. Thank you, sir. "I need 100 men, picks and shovels. This is going to be dangerous work, so you must be sober. If you've had any liquor today, go somewhere else. Mr. Sheridan here is from the city, and he will show us where to start." And so, with his 100 men, James Purcell and the group started to dig a trench through the St. Louis Dam. It took them a good part of 2 hours, and when the trench was finished, the water started to flow down towards Preston, but it wasn't the volume they were looking for. So they moved back a little bit and started a second trench. And they got that dug, and more water started to flow. But the water pressure behind the dam started to erode out that ridge between the two trenches. And when that ridge was gone, it started to erode down into a V, and the water really started to flow, and Dow's Great Swamp was born again.
The water rolled out of the reservoir, steadily advancing on the shacks of Sherwood, flooding Ottawa's impoverished. And as that water gained momentum, it undercut foundations, uprooted fences, pushed over shacks, flooded chicken coops, ripped branches from the trees, pulled boards from houses, and those branches and boards swirled in the water, battering the houses, the farm buildings, as it rushed down towards the water, the river. Homes were lost, livelihoods devastated, not by the fire, but by the water let loose by neighbors to save the city from that fire.
By late afternoon, the fire had subsided somewhat. The wind had died down considerably. The fire was never able to jump that gap, and it had consumed most of what we'll call the easy burnables on the west side. It allowed men who had been on that fire line to be reassigned from the swamp area to other areas of the city where they were more needed. But it wasn't the end of the Great Wildfire. The fire burned on for another 5 weeks through Gloucester Township, down towards Greens Creek, and the area that we call Orleans today. On the northern side of the river, it burned up the Gatineau most of the way to Wakefield, and then down the north shore all the way to opposite Montreal Island. But for the city of Ottawa, the beginning of the end was the 24th of September, the first day that it started to rain. And it rained hard and it rained steadily for a few days. And the fire was finally brought under control.
Sheriff Powell gave his final report. He started with a description. One of the workers had been sent to the top of the bell tower on the top of City Hall, and from there he had spotted 9 distinct fires surrounding the city. Of course, the city had provided $5,000 in relief aid. It went to those deserving needy And the city made good and sure it didn't go to any of the undeserving. The province matched that $5,000, and for the first time in Canadian history, the federal government put forward monies to help those who suffered from a natural disaster. Sheriff Powell noted the precedent, but it was the people. It was friends, neighbors, strangers who offered food, shelter, household goods, expertise, muscle power. Just as we saw last May, it was the people. James Purcell went back to work in Mr. Baldwin's mill. His innovations, just part of a day's work. Penny, he had seed in the spring, and he offered it for 2.5 times the price of the year before. His neighbors band together. They made sure that they found seed farther up the valley, and nobody paid Penny's prices. Mrs. Hogan, her 9-year-old, and her 5-year-old took those boards over the slough and they rebuilt the cowshed. They took old, burnt timbers and refashioned a shelter for themselves. They fenced their land, and in so doing, they made the requirements for homesteading. The Hogan family held title to that land and farmed that land for more than 100 years. In every natural disaster, there are the creative, innovative Purcells, the pinching Pennies, and the hard-working, tenacious Hogans.